Imagine a human column 1 million strong, moving under a relentless sun, a living river of tents and flocks and children stretching across the sand until the horizon blurs. Picture that column halted before a landscape that gives nothing freely. No wells, no markets, no wheat fields. And then ask the single urgent question that haunts every logician and theologian who studies the Exodus. How did they survive? Exodus 12 tells us who moved, not only the descendants of Jacob, but a mixed multitude that swelled the procession. Men and women, elders and infants, slaves recently freed, tribal leaders and strangers from other nations, a vast, heterogeneous people on the move. If you lay them out shoulder to shoulder, some scholars estimate a line that could run for hundreds of kilometers. The image helps us grasp the scale. This was not a caravan of a few hundred. This was the making of a nation under conditions that should have broken it. But scale alone does not explain survival. Two realities worked together, human structure and divine provision. One without the other would have been insufficient. God provided daily sustenance in ways the community could recognize as miraculous. At the same time, the people lived by an organizational framework that turned chaos into coherence. To understand how 1 million people crossed Sinai, we must see both the miracle and the method. First, the human scaffolding. Numbers 2 offers a striking picture. The camp arranged by tribes, each with its standard, each family given a place under the larger banner of Israel. Encampments, assigned positions, and a marching order reduced the brute confusion of 1 million people to a manageable social geography. Think of it less as an ancient military parade and more as a carefully zoned mobile city. Kitchens, tent rows, areas for animals, and pathways for movement. This arrangement did not happen by accident. It was a social architecture embedded in Scripture, meant to protect identity and maintain order. Complementing that was a change in governance recorded in Exodus 18. Moses, overwhelmed by disputes and appeals from a people who sought him day and night, received counsel from Jethro to deputize judges, capable men to handle lesser matters while the weightier issues remained with Moses. This decentralization is striking. Leadership distributed, responsibility shared. When a single person cannot hear every lawsuit or settle every feud, systems must be put in place. Jethro's reform turned Moses' burden into a multi-tiered judiciary, and that administrative evolution was part of the survival package. For 1 million people to live and move together, dispute resolution, local authority, and delegated leadership were essential. But structure alone would have failed if there had been no daily bread. Exodus records a pattern of provision that is almost liturgical in its rhythm. Water where none should be, bread that appeared with the dawn, flocks of quail arriving as a sign and a test. At Marah, Exodus 15:22-25, bitter water became sweet after a tree was cast into it, a sign that the wilderness would not remain hostile. Later, at Rephidim, Exodus 17, Moses strikes the rock and water gushes. Paul later remembers that rock as a spiritual symbol, 1 Corinthians 10:4, but in its immediate context, it was a literal lifeline for camps and animals alike. These episodes are not incidental extras, they are the backbone of day-to-day survival. Then there was manna. The account in Exodus 16 describes a substance that appeared with the dew, like frost on the ground, fine, flaky, and capable of being ground and baked. The rules around it were precise. Gather enough for each household each day. On the 6th day, gather a double portion to honor the 7th day when none would fall. Don't hoard. Don't let it rot unless hoarded against God's command. The pattern made provision predictable. The people learned a ritual of dependence. morning gathering, daily trust, and the Sabbath exception that trained the nation into a rhythm of work and rest. This was a provision that encouraged community discipline as much as it softened hunger. Not all the miracles taught humility and obedience. Numbers 11 tells a darker lesson. Quail arrived in such numbers that the people had meat to eat, but their craving and ingratitude turned the gift into a judgment at times. The quail incident exposes an important dynamic. Miraculous provision invites moral responsibility. To receive daily bread was to learn stewardship, not merely of resources, but of heart posture toward the provider. Alongside provision, social cohesion was enforced by law and priestly oversight. The Levites, set apart for sacred duties, acted as a stabilizing force in the camp. Their role moved beyond ritual. In Exodus, after the golden calf, Exodus 32, Levites were given a grim task to restore covenantal purity, an act understood in the narrative as an attempt to repair a rupture in communal identity. Later, laws and disciplinary measures sought to maintain the fabric of a people bound by a covenant. At times, enforcement took severe forms. The episode of the man gathering sticks on the Sabbath, Numbers 15, and the rebellion led by Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, Numbers 16, both resulted in dramatic, even fatal outcomes. The text treats these not as spectacles of cruelty, but as sober responses to actions that threatened the survival of the whole. The rebellion of Korah is especially instructive. It was not merely a power struggle, it was an existential threat to the order the community required. When leadership is undermined, the social norms that make collective life possible unravel. The earth swallowing the rebels, Numbers 16. A striking image, recounted with theological seriousness, communicates the narrative's conviction that covenantal order matters. Scripture frames discipline not as arbitrary violence, but as a painful instrument meant to preserve the living community. We must approach such scenes with grave sobriety. They are theological judgments narrated to explain how this people preserved its identity amid chaos. In the wilderness, the law functioned as social glue. Rules about Sabbath rest, ritual purity, redistribution, and dispute resolution were not irrelevant piety. They were public health, economic policy, and military readiness, all wrapped into a covenantal framework. When a camp of 1 million has no hospitals and few artisans, the moral code becomes a survival code. Obedience sustained cohesion. Transgression threatened it. Women played an indispensable role within this matrix of survival. Miriam appears early and complexly in the narrative. She leads alongside her brothers in song at the shore, Exodus 15, and later her challenge to Moses' authority results in her being struck with a temporary skin disease, Numbers 12, a shock that humbles the community and underscores the limits of human pride. Yet Miriam's presence alters the gender map of leadership in the wilderness. She is a prophetess, a spiritual anchor, and a visible figure in public memory. Beyond Miriam, the story of the daughters of Zelophehad, Numbers 27 and 26, provides a legal breakthrough that adjusts inheritance law when there were no male heirs. Their petition to Moses did not receive a hurried dismissal. Rather, it became the basis for clarified tribal succession and protection of property rights. That decision matters for survival. Secure inheritance keeps families intact and land claims coherent for the future settlement in Canaan. In the daily life of the camp, women were also prime actors in sustenance, gathering, preparing, and storing the manna, birthing the next generation, nursing and organizing household economies. Their agency is woven into the practical and legal scaffolding that allowed a people to endure. Crisis punctuated the journey. Fear, complaint, and rebellion recur like a drumbeat. The episode of the spies sent into Canaan, Numbers 13 through 14, reveals the tipping point. 10 spies return with fearful reports, magnifying obstacles and minimizing promise. The nation's response, a collective refusal to enter the land, triggers a theological verdict. The adult generation that refused to trust God would not enter the promised land. The punishment is communal and profound. A 40-year sojourn, the death of a generation in the wilderness, and the forging of a new people molded by experience and discipline. This doctrinally heavy moment is also sociologically significant. A society that cannot envision its future will not sustain the institutions necessary for survival. The delay, though painful, had an unintended consequence. It became a period of formation. Children born in the wilderness grew up knowing only the rhythm of dependence, law, and encampment. They learned the stories at their mother's feet, marched under tribal standards, and internalized the patterns of obedience that would sit them well when, decades later, they crossed the Jordan to claim territory. The scandals and plagues recorded in Numbers, serpents sent among the people, Numbers 21, the outbreak at Peor halted by the zeal of Phinehas, are not mere sensational episodes. They are cautionary tales about what undermines communal survival: unbridled appetite, idolatry, and a failure to respect covenant boundaries. Phinehas's action, controversial and dramatic, is narrated not as celebration of violence, but as the desperate cure to halt a plague that threatened to annihilate the community. The narrative reframes the event as a moment where decisive intervention restored the possibility of continued life for the nation as a whole. Through all these trials, Moses remains the central human agent. His leadership is a study in paradox: burdened, interceding, at times impatient, yet steadfast. His last act of leadership is both poignant and instructive. Deuteronomy and the closing of his life in Deuteronomy 34 mark the end of an era. He sees the land from a distance but does not enter, a sobering capstone that underscores the cost of a nation's choices. The mantle passes to Joshua and Caleb, representatives of the minority that trusted God's promise and would lead the new generation into fulfillment. We cannot ignore the practicalities beneath the miracle narratives. Decisions about food distribution, rule enforcement, delegated justice, and tribal arrangement were not optional extras. They were survival mechanisms. The Sabbath law, for instance, was more than a spiritual rest. In the wilderness context, it functioned as a communal rhythm that prevented exhaustion, conserved resources, and reinforced trust that provision would come when needed. The rule against hoarding manna forced dependents to rely on daily provision, reducing the risk of crippling inequalities or famine in the camp's mobile ecosystem. Nor should we romanticize the wilderness into a benevolent retreat. The desert was a refining fire. It stripped dependencies, exposed weakness, and forced the community to learn new virtues. Those virtues were not merely personal piety, but collective disciplines: patience, trust, respect for authority, and a shared identity shaped by common practice. Survival in this narrative is as much cultural as it is physical. A people must learn how to be a people before they can thrive as a nation. This interplay between miracle and method culminates in the story's climax: the transformation of a fugitive group into a nation ready to possess a land. 40 years in the desert is the crucible here. The generation that left Egypt largely perished because of unbelief and rebellion. Their children, forged within the rhythms of provision and law, crossed over into Canaan with a different moral architecture. The narrative drives home a painful but clear theological lesson: the cost of freedom is responsibility. The promised land is obtained not by mere deliverance from slavery, but by a people shaped for covenantal life. Ask now, what does "survived against all odds" mean within this framework? It is not a claim that survival was inevitable because the people did everything correctly. Far from it. The Exodus story shows repeated failures, groans of complaint, and moral lapses. Rather, survival emerges from the synergy of divine fidelity and human cooperation. God supplied water and bread. Human institutions organized distribution and adjudicated conflicts. God set boundaries and signs. Human leadership enforced them, sometimes with tragic outcomes, to protect the community at large. The wilderness journey teaches that miracles alone are insufficient if the human community does not cultivate structures that sustain them. There is, too, a tension the narrative never allows us to gloss over, the relationship between grace and responsibility. Miracles like manna teach dependence, law teaches discipline. Jethro's judicial reform teaches the necessity of distributed authority. The Levite's role teaches the importance of intermediaries in maintaining sacred and civic order. Women's legal victories and visible leadership show that survival was not monolithic. It depended on multiple voices and forms of agency. The entire story resists a simplistic reading that either glorifies miraculous intervention without ethical consequence or reduces the divine to a mere facilitator of human enterprise. Survival in Sinai required both. If the story of the Exodus has a practical echo for communities today, it is this: resilience requires systems as much as it requires hope. A community that trusts in provision but does not tend its institutions will not endure. Conversely, even the best institutions cannot compensate for a loss of moral imagination. A people can organize themselves to death. The Israelites survived because, imperfect as they were, they practiced habits that shaped communal identity while continually facing the reality of a God who provided in ways they could not manufacture. One final detail bears emphasis. The narrative repeatedly frames provision as routine rather than a string of isolated wonders. Water at Marah, the rock at Rephidim, manna's daily fall, these became the everyday grammar of life in the desert. They were not once-in-a-lifetime spectacles, but recurring realities that trained a people into trust. This repetition matters. A nation that experiences the miraculous as habit learns to organize around it, to legislate for it, and to build institutions that channel its effects into long-term survival. So how did 1 million people survive against all odds? They survived because miracle and method met. Divine provision supplied the raw necessities. Human design distributed them. Law and discipline preserved the social fabric. Leadership delegated authority and settled disputes. Women's agency and legal innovations preserved family lines and social continuity. The crucible of crisis purged illusions and prepared a generation to receive a land. Survival in the Sinai looked less like a single headline miracle and more like a slow weaving of the miraculous into daily life. A covenantal pattern that taught a people how to live together. Let that image stay with you. A vast mobile society learning the habits of dependence, learning to legislate life, being disciplined into identity. The Exodus is not only an ancient rescue story, it is an extended case study in how communities endure when everything outside them threatens to collapse. It is a narrative that refuses to let us separate God's action from human responsibility or mercy from the hard work of order. If this deep dive into Exodus is speaking to you and you want to explore how these themes play out in other biblical narratives, how divine provision and communal structure interact in surprising ways, stay with us and subscribe for more historical explorations and theological reflections. Finally, consider this question as you leave. When a community faces its desert, whether literal scarcity, social breakdown, or moral drift, what combination of provision, structure, discipline, and hopeful imagination will allow it not just to survive, but to be transformed? The Exodus offers no simple formula, only a testimony. Survival against all odds often arrives through the patient intertwining of God's faithfulness and human fidelity.